about analytical procedures. Analytical procedures में ये पहला correct incorrect के लिए बहुत ही important है that since routine checks cannot be depended upon to disclose all the mistakes or manipulation that may exist in the accounts, certain other procedures also have to be applied like comparisons, trend and ratio analysis in addition to the reasonableness test. They collectively are known as overall tests. With the passage of test, analytical procedures have acquired a lot of significance. The substantive audit procedures, क्योंकि बहुत सारे टेस्ट इन्वॉल्व है तो उसका ज़्यादातर significance substantive audit procedures से आता है. And the essay that deals with analytical procedure is essay 520. Yeah, so it is essay 520 on analytical procedures, discusses the application of analytical procedures during an audit. तो हमने इधर क्या पढ़ा कि routine checks cannot be dependent upon to disclose all the mistakes and manipulation that may exist in accounts. So other procedures also have to be applied in like your comparison, trend, ratio analysis in addition to reasonableness test. They collectively are known as overall test. What is analytical procedures as per essay 520? Means evaluation of financial information through analysis of possible relationship between financial and non-financial data. ठीक है, उसके साथ साथ investigation भी included है. So analytical procedure also encompass such investigation as is necessary of identified fluctuations or relationships that are inconsistent with relevant information or that differ from expected values by a significant amount, right? So what is analytical procedures? Analytical procedures means evaluation of financial information through analysis of plausible relationship between financial and non-financial data. It also encompasses investigation as is necessary of identified fluctuations or relationships that are inconsistent with other relevant information or that differ from expected values by a significant अमाउंट. एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स इंक्लूड, और वो तो डेफिनेशन है, उसके साथ ही साथ वो कंपैरिजन भी इंक्लूड करते हैं, राइट? सो एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स इंक्लूड द कंसिडरेशन ऑफ कंपैरिजन ऑफ द एंटिटीज फाइनेंशियल इंफॉर्मेशन एज वेल एज द कंसिडरेशन ऑफ रिलेशनशिप्स. तो फाइनेंशियल इंफॉर्मेशन और रिलेशनशिप्स भी इंक्लूडेड है हमारे एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स के डेफिनेशन में, राइट? What are the examples of analytical procedures having consideration of comparisons of the entity's financial information? जैसे कि it is your comparable information for prior period, anticipated results future में of the entity such as budgets or forecasts or expectations of the auditor such as an estimation of depreciation. फिर similar industry information such as comparison of the entity's ratio of sales to accounts receivable with industry averages or with other entities of a comparable size in the same industry. What would be the examples having consideration of relationships among elements of financial information that would be expected to confirm a predictable pattern based on the entity's experience, such as gross margin percentage, between financial information and relevant non-financial information such as payroll cost to number of employees. Payroll cost is your financial and number of employees is your non-financial, right? Next is your various methods to be used to perform analytical procedures is again consideration of relationship. These methods range from performing simple comparisons to performing complex analysis using advanced techniques. Analytical procedures may be applied to consolidated financial statement components and individual elements of information. तो CFS को भी आप अप्लाई कर सकते हो, individual elements के लिए भी आप अप्लाई कर सकते हो. So analytical procedures may be applied to consolidated financial statements, components and individual elements of information. Thus we can say that analytical procedures may be segregated into the following types, like comparison of client and industry data, comparison of client data with similar prior period data, comparison of client data with client determined and expected results, comparison of client data with auditor determined expected results, and comparison of client data with expected results using non-financial data. So this is all about some introduction of essay 520. तो पहले क्या देखा, रूटीन चेक के ऊपर डिपेंडेंट नहीं हो सकते. फिर एपी का हमने डेफिनेशन देखा. उस डेफिनेशन में क्या लिखोगे, इट ऑल्सो इंक्लूड्स द कंसिडरेशन ऑफ कंपेरिजन ऑफ द एंटिटीज फाइनेंशियल इंफॉर्मेशन विद एज वेल एज कंसिडरेशन ऑफ रिलेशनशिप्स. कंसिडरेशन ऑफ एंटिटीज फाइनेंशियल इन्फॉर्मेशन में क्या क्या एग्जाम्पल्स है? कंपेरेबल इन्फॉर्मेशन फॉर प्रायर पीरियड, एंटिसिपेटेड रिजल्ट्स ऑफ द एंटिटी सच एज बजट्स और फोरकास्ट और एक्सपेक्टेशंस ऑफ द ऑडिटर सच एज estimation of depreciation, similar industry information such as comparison of the entity's ratio of sales to account receivable with the industry averages or with other entities of the comparable size in the same industry. Some consideration of relationships के क्या example होंगे? Among elements of financial information that would be expected टू कन्फर्म, देख कुछ एलिमेंट्स हो गए फाइनेंशियल इन्फॉर्मेशन में जो कन्फर्म करते हैं एक प्रेडिक्टेबल पैटर्न बेस्ड ऑन द एंटिटीज एक्सपीरियंस, जैसे कि ग्रॉस मार्जिन परसेंटेजेस, ठीक है वो. फिर बिटवीन फाइनेंशियल एंड रिलेवेंट नॉन फाइनेंशियल इन्फॉर्मेशन सच एज पेरोल कॉस्ट एंड नंबर ऑफ employees, right? Various methods may be used to perform analytical procedures. These methods range from performing simple comparison to performing complex analysis using advanced statistical techniques. Analytical procedures may be applied to consolidated financial statements, components and individual elements of information, right? They may be segregated into the following types, जैसे कि कंपेयर करना क्लाइंट डेटा को इंडस्ट्री डेटा, प्रायर पीरियड डेटा, क्लाइंट डिटरमाइंड एक्सपेक्टेड रिजल्ट, ऑडिटर डिटरमाइंड एक्सपेक्टेड रिजल्ट एंड एक्सपेक्टेड रिजल्ट यूजिंग नॉट फाइनेंशियल डेटा. अभी ऐसे 520 किस चीज़ से डील करता है? इट डील्स विद द ऑडिटर्स यूज ऑफ एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स और सब्सटैंटिव प्रोसीजर्स एज प्रोसीजर्स नियर द एंड ऑफ द ऑडिट दैट रिजल्ट एज इज द ऑडिटर व्हेन फॉर्मिंग एन ओवरऑल कंक्लूजन ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल स्टेटमेंट. तो ये ऐसे 520 क्या बोलते हैं कि ऑडिटर ना एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर को सब्सटैंटिव प्रोसीजर की यूज़ करता है एंड एज प्रोसीजर, और साथ ही साथ procedures near the end of the audit that assess the auditor when forming an overall conclusion of the financial statement. The use of analytical procedures as risk assessment procedure is dealt with in 315. तो अगर analytical procedures को रैप की तरह देखना है तो वो 315 में डिस्कस है. और 330 includes the requirements and guidance regarding the nature, timing, extent of audit procedures in response to assessed risk. These audit procedures may include substantive analytical procedures. So I hope the scope of 520 is clear. 520 आएगा, 315 आएगा, 330 आएगा. 330 में क्या क्या बोला है कि आप एसेस रिस्क को कैसे रेस्पॉन्स करोगे. तो कुछ वो ऑडिट प्रोसीजर्स में सब्सटैंटिव एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स में भी इंक्लूड there as well. So again, revising scope of SA 520 deals with the auditor's use of analytical procedures as substantive procedures and as procedures near the end of the audit that assists the auditor in forming an overall conclusion of the financial statement. The use of analytical procedures as RAP is discussed in SA 315. 330 includes requirements and guidance regarding nature, timing, extent of audit procedures in response to assessed risk. These audit procedures may include substantively analytical procedures. What are the objectives of auditor? To obtain relevant and reliable audit evidence when using substantive analytical procedures, to design and perform analytical procedures near the end of the audit that assists the auditor when forming an overall conclusion as to whether the financial statements are consistent with the auditor's understanding of the entity. तो 520 के हिसाब से ऑडिटर के क्या ऑब्जेक्टिव्स होने चाहिए कि हमारे पास जो ऑडिट एविडेंस है वो रेलेवेंट एंड रिलायबल ऑडिट एविडेंस हमको चाहिए. रेलेवेंट, सफिशिएंट एंड अप्रोप्रिएट नहीं, रेलेवेंट एंड रिलायबल ऑडिट एविडेंस चाहिए यूजिंग सब्सटैंटिव एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स. तो RNR AE यूजिंग SAP. फिर DNP design and perform analytical procedures near the end of the audit that assists the auditor when forming an overall conclusion as to whether financial statements are consistent with the auditor's understanding of the entity. Now, what is the purpose of the analytical procedures? Just a second. Okay, मैंने purpose note down नहीं किया है. Okay, what is the purpose of the analytical procedures? Analytical procedures use comparisons and relationships to assess whether account balance or other data appear reasonable or not. तो जो हमारे चीज़ें हैं वो appear reasonably कर रहे हैं कि नहीं उसके लिए हम ये यूज़ करते हैं. So analytical procedures use comparisons and relationships to assess whether account balances or other data appear reasonable. For instance, establishing the relationship that exists between certain balances included in the balance sheet and the statement of P&L and comparing them with those existed between same set of balances in the previous year. That could be an example. Yeah, reconciling the physical balance of assets with the relevant financial records. We're obtaining of account from the bankers, account receivables and account payables, and reconciling with relevant books in books of accounts. We're confirming amounts of outstanding income and expense by preparing reconciliation statements. So these are very helpful in detection of unusual state of affairs and mistakes in accounts, right? नेक्स्ट इज टाइमिंग ऑफ एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स. आप एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स कब कब परफॉर्म करते हो? प्लानिंग फेज, टेस्टिंग फेज, कंप्लीशन फेज. प्लानिंग फेज, टेस्टिंग फेज, कंप्लीशन फेज. Experienced auditors use analytical procedures in all stages of audit, are required in the planning stage, and it is often used during the testing phase. In addition, these are also required during the completion phase as well. Analytical, जब आप प्लानिंग करती हो तो तब एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स का क्या रोल होता है? प्लानिंग में एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर हेल्प करता है ऑडिटर को अंडरस्टैंडिंग द क्लाइंट्स बिजनेस, आइडेंटिफाइंग द एरियाज ऑफ पोटेंशियल रिस्क बाय इंडिकेटिंग एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ and development in the entity's business of which he was previously unaware. This information will assist the auditor in determining the nature, timing, and extent of his other audit procedures. Analytical procedures in planning the audit use both financial and non-financial data such as number of employees, square feet of selling space, volume of goods produced, and similar information. So analytical procedures in planning the audit. In planning stage, the analytical procedure assists the auditor in understanding the client business and in identifying areas of potential risk by indicating aspects of and developments in the entity's business of which he was previously unaware. This information will assist the auditor in determining the nature, timing, extent of other audit procedures. Analytical procedures in planning the audit use both financial and non-financial data, right? Next is substantive analytical procedures. The auditor's substantive procedures at the assertion level may be test of details, substantive analytical procedures, or a combination of both. The decision about which audit procedure to perform, including whether to use substantive analytical procedure, is based on the auditor's judgment about the expected effectiveness and efficiency of the available audit procedure to reduce the audit risk to an at the assertion level to an acceptably low level. The auditor may require the management as to the availability and reliability of information needed to apply substantive analytical procedure and the results of any such analytical procedures performed by the entity. तो इंक्वायर क्या करेगा? अवेलेबिलिटी एंड रिलायबिलिटी ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन को इंक्वायर करेगा, ठीक है, to apply substantive analytical procedures and inquire करेगा कि the results of any such analytical procedures performed by the entity. It may be effective to use analytical data prepared by management. तो management ने जो analytical data prepare किया है वो effectively आप use कर सकते हो provided the auditor is satisfied that such data is properly prepared. Yeah, it is properly prepared. Next, what are the factors to be considered for substantive audit procedures? Audit procedures, ठीक है, ये important है. Factors to be considered for substantive audit procedures. Memory technique क्या होगी? Eggs में पहले availability of eggs, disaggregation of eggs, then account type, source मतलब source, and then good eggs bad eggs से क्या होगा? Nature of assertion, predictability, and कुछ एग पीछे छूटे होंगे तो इनहेरेंट वो सोचेंगे इनहेरेंट रिस्क और व्हाट कैन गो रॉन्ग, इनहेरेंट रिस्क और व्हाट कैन रॉन्ग. सो दीज आर द फैक्टर्स टू बी कंसिडर्ड फॉर substantive audit procedures. Availability of data, disaggregation, account type, source, nature of assertion, predictability, inherent risk or what can go wrong. Availability, the auditor should consider the following factors for substantive audit procedures. Availability of data में क्या देखोगे? The availability of relevant and reliable data will facilitate effective analytical procedures. The degree of disaggregation in the available data can directly affect the degree of its usefulness in detecting misstatements. Substantive analytical procedures are more useful for certain type of accounts than for others. जैसे कि income statement accounts tend to be more predictable because they reflect accumulated transactions over a period, whereas balance sheet items represent the net effect of the transaction at a point of time or are subject to a greater management judgment. सो उसके लिए क्या लिखोगे? सम क्लास ऑफ ट्रांजैक्शन टेंड टू बी मोर प्रेडिक्टेबल बिकॉज दे कंसिस्ट ऑफ न्यूमरस सिमिलर ट्रांजैक्शंस थ्रू रूटीन प्रोसेसेस, whereas the transactions recorded by non-routine and estimation significant class of transactions are often subject to management judgment and therefore more difficult to predict. Nature of assertion क्या है? Substantive analytical procedures may be more effective in providing evidence for some assertions than for others. Predictive analytical procedures using data analytics can be used to address completeness, valuation, measurement and occurrence. Predictability के लिए क्या लिखोगे? Substantive analytical procedures are more appropriate when account balance or relationship between the items of data are predictable. A predictable relationship is one that may reasonably be expected to exist and continue over time. Inherent risk or what can go wrong में क्या लिखोगे? When we are designing audit procedures to address an inherent risk or what can go wrong, we consider the nature of risk of material misstatement in order to determine if the substantive analytical procedures can be used to obtain audit evidence. जहाँ पे inherent significant risk is higher, we may also design test of details to address higher inherent risk. Audit evidence obtained solely from SAP is likely to be sufficient. So this is all about the factors to be considered for substantive audit procedures. Next, what are the techniques available as substantive procedures? It could be a trend, ratio, reasonableness and structural modeling. The design of a substantive analytical procedure is limited only by the availability of reliable data and experience and creativity of the audit team. ठीक है, रेशियो एनालिसिस आरटीओ देखोगे, ठीक है, ट्रेंड एनालिसिस, रेशियो एनालिसिस, रीजनेबल एनालिसिस। ट्रेंड एनालिसिस में क्या है? इट इज अ commonly used technique. It is the comparison of the current data with the prior period balance or with a trend in two or more prior period balances. Auditor क्या evaluate करता है? Whether the current balance of an account moves in line with the trend established with previous balances for that account or moves based on an understanding of factors that may cause the account to change. In other words, trend analysis implies analyzing account fluctuations by comparing current year to prior year information and also to information derived over several years. So I hope what is trend analysis? Again, it is a commonly used technique. It is the comparison of current data with the prior period balances or with a trend in two or more prior period balances. Auditor evaluates whether the current balance of an account moves in line with the trend established with the previous balances for that account or moves based on the understanding of the factors that may cause the account to change. In other words, trend analysis implies analyzing account fluctuations by comparing current year to prior year information and also to information derived over several years. What is ratio analysis? Ratio analysis is useful for analyzing assets and liability accounts and as well as revenue and expense accounts. So ratio analysis. An individual balance sheet account is difficult to predict on its own, but its relationship to another account is often more predictable. An individual balance sheet account is difficult to predict on its own, but its relationship to another account is often more predictable. Ratios can also be compared over time or the ratios of separate entities within the group or with the ratios of other companies in the same industry. तो रेशियो को किससे आप कंपेयर कर सकते हो? ओवर द टाइम और द रेशियो ऑफ सेपरेट एंटिटीज विद इन द ग्रुप और विद द रेशियोज ऑफ अदर कंपनीज इन द सेम इंडस्ट्री. एग्जाम्पल, फाइनेंशियल रेशियोज में इंक्लूड ट्रेड रिसीवेबल और इन्वेंट्री टर्नओवर, प्राइड एक्सपेंस एज अ परसेंटेज ऑफ सेल्स रेवेन्यू. तो रेशियो एनालिसिस कहाँ कहाँ पे आप यूजफुल है फॉर एनालाइजिंग एसेट, लाइबिलिटी, रेवेन्यू, expense account. Individual balance sheet account is difficult to predict on its own, but its relationship with other account is often more predictable. It can be compared over time, separate entities within the group, other companies in the same industry. What is reasonableness test? Unlike trend analysis, the analytical procedures does not rely events of prior period, but upon the non-financial data for the audit period under consideration. तो जब एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स रिलाई करता है अपॉन नॉन फाइनेंशियल डेटा, उसको हम रीजनेबल टेस्ट बोलेंगे. So unlike trend analysis, this analytical procedures does not rely on the events of the prior period but upon the non-financial data for the audit period under consideration. Example, occupancy rate to estimate rental income, interest rate to estimate income or expenditure. These tests are generally more applicable to income statement accounts. तो रीजनेबल टेस्ट में हम नॉन फाइनेंशियल डेटा की हेल्प लेते हैं. So these tests are generally more applicable to income statement accounts and certain accrual or prepayment accounts. In other words, these tests are made by reviewing the relationship to other balances for reasonableness of amount. Example, interest expense against interest bearing obligations, raw material consumption to production, wastages and scrap against production or raw material consumption, work in progress based on issued of materials and sales, sales discount and commissions against sales volume, rental revenues based on occupancy of parameters. So these are all about reasonable test. Again, unlike trend analysis, the analytical procedures do not rely on the events of prior period but upon the non-financial data for the audit period under consideration. These tests are generally more applicable to income statement accounts and certain accrual or prepayment accounts. In other words, these tests are made by reviewing the relationship to other balances for the reasonableness of the amount. And कुछ examples you will consider. What is structural modeling? A modeling tool constructs a structural model from financial or non-financial data of prior accounting period to predict the current account balances. Like for example, linear regression. तो structural modeling में क्या होता है, एक modeling tools होते हैं जो एक construct करते हैं एक structural model from financial and non-financial data of prior accounting period to predict current account balances. Example, linear regression, right? So this was all about ratio analysis and all of that. Next, analytical procedures used as substantive test. Analytical procedures को हम substantive test की तरह use करते हैं. When designing and performing substantive analytical procedures, either alone or in combination with test of details as substantive procedures in accordance with A330, the auditor shall determine the suitability of analytical procedures. तो मैंने इधर लाइफस्टाइल का जीन्स का देखा कि क्या वो जीन्स मेरे को सूटेबल है. तो determining the suitability of analytical procedures, evaluating the reliability of the data, developing an expectation and then determining acceptable difference. So what are the points? Determining the suitability of analytical procedures, evaluating the reliability of data, developing an expectation, determining an acceptable difference, right? Now let's discuss one by one. First one is determining the suitability of particular substantive analytical procedures for given assertions, taking into account of assets, risk of material misstatement and test of details if any for these assertions. Evaluating the reliability of data from which the auditor's expectation of the recorded amounts or ratio is developed, taking account of source, comparability, nature and relevance of information available and controls over preparation. Develop an expectation of recorded amounts or ratios and evaluate whether the expectation is sufficiently precise to identify a misstatement that individually or when aggregated with other misstatements may cause a financial statement to be materially misstated. Determine the amount of any difference of recorded amounts from expected. So difference of any recorded amounts from expected values that is acceptable without further investigation. So this is how analytical procedures can be used as substantive test by keeping this memory technique in mind. Next is suitability for particular analytical procedures for given assertion. Next, suitability of a particular analytical procedure for given assertion. कैसे analytical procedure suitable हो सकते हैं for some given assertions? Generally they are more applicable. कब वो more applicable माने जाएंगे? They are more applicable to large volume of transactions that tend to be predictable over time. तो वो suitable होंगे, right? So generally more applicable to large volume of transactions that tend to be more predictable over time. The application of planned analytical procedure is based on the expectation that relationship जो है वो exist करता है among the data and continue in the absence of known condition to the contrary. So relationship among the data exist and continue in the absence of known conditions to the contrary. Where, however, the suitability of the particular analytical procedure will depend on the auditor's assessment of how effective it will be in detecting a misstatement that individually or when aggregated with other misstatements may cause the financial statements to be materially misstated. In some cases, even on an unsophisticated predictive model, an unsophisticated predictive model may be effective as an analytical procedure. So कुछ cases में even an unsophisticated predictive model may be effective analytical procedure. So these are the 4 cases where a particular analytical procedures are suitable for given assertions. What are they? Generally more applicable to large volume of transactions that tend to be predictable over time. The application of the planned analytical procedure is based on the expectation that a relationship among the data exist and continue in the absence of known conditions to the contrary. However, the suitability of a particular analytical procedure will depend upon the auditor's assessment of how effective it will be in detecting a misstatement that individually or when aggregated with other misstatement may cause the financial statements to be materially misstated. In some cases, even an unsophisticated predictive model may be effective as an analytical procedure. Okay. अभी अभी ये करेक्ट इनकरेक्ट के लिए बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट है कि बहुत सारे टाइप के एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स बहुत सारे टाइप के अश्योरेंस देता है. सो डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स प्रोवाइड डिफरेंट लेवल्स ऑफ अश्योरेंस, जैसे कि एनालिटिकल प्रोसीजर्स फॉर इन्वॉल्विंग फॉर एग्जाम्पल द प्रेडिक्शन ऑफ total rental income on a building divided into apartments, taking the rental rates, the number of apartments, and the vacancy rates into consideration, can provide pervasive evidence and may eliminate the need for further verification by means of test of details, provided the elements are appropriately verified. तो ये हो गया हमारे rental income का example की analytical procedures that involving for example the prediction of total rental income on a building divided into apartments, taking the rental rates, the number of apartments, and the vacancy rates into consideration, can provide persuasive evidence and may eliminate the need for future verification by means of test of details, provided the elements are appropriately verified. In contrast, calculation and comparison of gross margin percentage as a means of confirming revenue figure कंफर्म करने के लिए आप कैलकुलेशन और कंपेयर करते हो अपने ग्रॉस मार्जिन परसेंटेज को, may provide less persuasive evidence but may provide useful corroboration if used in combination with other audit procedures. So in contrast, calculation and comparison of gross margin percentage as a means of confirming a revenue figure may provide less persuasive evidence but may provide useful corroboration if used in combination with other audit procedures. The determination of the suitability of a particular and substantive analytical procedures is influenced by the nature of the assertion and auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement. For example, if controls over sales order processing are weak, the auditor may place more relevance on test of details rather than substantive analytical procedures for assertions related to the receivables. Particular substantive analytical procedures may also be considered suitable when test of details are performed on the same assertion. For example, when obtaining audit evidence regarding valuation assertion for accounts receivable balances, the auditor may apply analytical procedures of an aging customer account in addition to performing test of details on subsequent cash receipts to determine the collectability of the receivables, right? Next, the reliability of the data. अच्छा, इसका मैंने नहीं बनाया हुआ है. Okay. Reliability of the data is influenced by its source, the nature, and is dependent on the circumstances under which it is obtained. Accordingly, the following are relevant when determining whether the data is reliable for the purpose of designing substantive analytical procedures. Source of information, comparability of the information, nature and relevance, controls over the preparation of the financial information, right? So source of the information available, for example, information may be more reliable when it is obtained from the independent sources outside the entity. Comparability of the information available, for example, broad industry data may need to be supplemented to be comparable to that of an entity that produces, sell and sell specialized products. Nature and relevance of the information available, where the budgets have been established as results to be expected rather than as goals to be achieved. Controls over the preparation of the information that are designed to ensure its completeness, accuracy, and validity. For example, controls over the preparation and review and maintenance of budgets. The auditor may consider testing the operating effectiveness of controls, if any, over the entity's preparation of information used by the auditor in performing SAP in response to the assessed risk. When such controls are effective, the auditor generally has greater confidence in the reliability of the information and therefore in the results of the analytical procedure. The operating effectiveness of controls over non-financial information may often be tested in conjunction with other tests of controls, right? For example, in establishing controls over the processing of sales invoices, an entity may include controls over the recording of unit sales. In these circumstances, the auditor may test the operating effectiveness of controls over the recording of unit sales in conjunction with the test of the operating effectiveness of control over the processing of sales invoices. Alternatively, the auditor may consider whether the information was subjected to audit testing, right? Evaluation of whether the expectation is sufficiently precise. Matters relevant to the auditor's evaluation of whether the expectation can be developed sufficiently precise is to identify a misstatement when aggregated with other misstatements may cause the financial statement to be materially misstated. So evaluation of whether the एक्सपेक्टेशन सफिशिएंटली प्रिसाइज है कि नहीं, तो क्या देखोगे? एक्यूरेसी विद द एक्सपेक्टेड रिजल्ट्स ऑफ द SAP कैन बी प्रेडिक्टेड. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, द ऑडिटर में expect greater consistency in comparing gross profit margin from one period to another than in comparing discretionary expenses such as research or advertising. The degree to which information can be disaggregated. SAP may be effective when applied to financial information on individual sections of an operation or to financial statements of components of a diversified entity than when applied to the financial statements of the entity as a whole. The availability of information, both financial and non-financial, the auditor may consider whether financial information and non-financial information is available to design SAP. If the information is available, the auditor may also consider the reliability of the information. So this is how you see whether the expectation is sufficiently precise or not to identify a misstatement. क्या देखोगे? Accuracy, the degree of which information can be disaggregated, the availability of information, both financial and non-financial data. Amount of difference of recorded amount from expected value that is acceptable. अभी difference आ रहा है than what is actually there and what we expected, तो उसके बीच में difference आ रहा है, तो कब वो acceptable होगा? The auditor's determination of the amount of difference from the expectation that can be accepted without further investigation is influenced by materiality and the consistency with the desired level of assurance. Is influenced by the materiality and consistency with the desired level of assurance, taking account of the possibility that a misstatement individually or when aggregated with other misstatement may cause the financial statement to be materially misstatement. SA 330 requires auditor to obtain more persuasive audit evidence, the higher the auditor's risk of assessment. Accordingly, as the assessed risk increases, the amount of difference considered acceptable without investigation decreases in order to achieve the desired level of persuasive evidence. ठीक है, तो अगर करेक्ट इनकरेक्ट में आता है तो क्या लिखोगे? जो ऑडिटर का डिटर्मिनेशन है ऑफ द अमाउंट ऑफ डिफरेंस फ्रॉम द एक्सपेक्टेशन दैट कैन बी एक्सेप्टेड विदाउट इन्वेस्टिगेशन इज इन्फ्लुएंस्ड by materially and the consistency with the desired level of assurance, taking account of the possibility that a misstatement individually और aggregate वो वाला लाइन. ऐसे 330 क्या चाहते हैं ऑडिटर की? वो ऑब्टेन करे ज़्यादा परसुएसिव एविडेंस द हायर द ऑडिटर्स असेसमेंट ऑफ रिस्क. अगर assessed risk increases, the amount of difference considered acceptable without investigation decreases in order to achieve desired level of persuasive evidence. Next, investigating the results of analytical procedures. If analytical procedures performed in accordance with SA 520 identify fluctuations or relationships that are inconsistent with the other relevant information or that differ from the expected values by a significant amount, the auditor shall investigate such difference by inquiry. Inquiring of management and obtaining appropriate audit evidence relevant to the management responses. Audit evidence that is relevant to the management response may be obtained by evaluating those responses, taking into account the auditor's understanding of the entity, its environment, and other audit evidence obtained during the course of the audit. Perform other audit procedures as necessary in the circumstances. They need to perform other audit procedures arise. For example, management is unable to provide an explanation or the example together with audit evidence obtained relevant to management response is not considered adequate. तो इंक्वायरी करोगे, परफॉर्म करोगे जब आप इन्वेस्टिगेट करना चाहते हो फ्लक्चुएशंस और डिविएशन. Now, consideration specific to public sector entity. The relationship between individual financial statements item traditionally considered in audit of business entity may not always be relevant in an audit of government or other non-business public sector entities. For example, in many public sector entities, there may be little direct relationship between revenue and expenditure. In addition, because expenditure and acquisition of asset may not be capitalized, there may be no relationship between expenditure. For example, inventories and fixed assets and amounts of those assets reported in financial statements. Also, industry data on statistics for comparative purposes may not be available in the public sector. However, other relationships may be relevant. For example, variations in the cost per kilometer of road construction or the number of vehicles acquired compared with the vehicles retired. ठीक है, तो ऐसे आप कंसिडरेशन पा सकते हो इन द पब्लिक सेक्टर units as well. Next, analytical procedures that assist when forming an overall conclusion. Conclusions drawn from the result of analytical procedures designed and performed in accordance with are intended. जो conclusions आप form करते हो वो corroborate होनी चाहिए. Conclusions formed during the audit of individual components or elements of the financial statements that assist the auditor to draw reasonable conclusions on which to base the auditor's opinion. The result of such analytical procedures may identify previously unrecognized risk of material misstatement. In such circumstances, auditor has to revise the auditor's assessment risk of material misstatement and modify the further planned audit procedures accordingly. तो जो conclusions होते हैं analytical procedures वो corroborate होने चाहिए. अगर वो recognize करता है रिस्क ऑफ मटेरियल मिसस्टेटमेंट तो ऑडिटर को रिवाइज करना पड़ेगा आरएमएम और मॉडिफाई करने पड़ेंगे फर्दर प्लान ऑडिट procedures को. So this is all about your chapter number 8.